Okay, so yeah, the like 14 and 1500s-ish European cartography of the world was not great. So as you can see here, the map is really not super representative of what things actually look like, but you can get the general idea. This red line here is the,
Mm-hmm.
you can see where my cursor is pointing,
Hmm. Yes, sir. I
right?
can.
So the red line, that's the line of Tordesillas. And everything on the west of that line, um, occidental to that line, you might say, is the Pope says that is Spain's like divine right to go and conquer and explore and colonize it, and everything to the east is Portugal.
Oh,
So Spain got the majority of the Americas, and the Portuguese got like Africa and all those islands there, which is why, for example, you have a lot of Portuguese islands that are really African islands, like Madeira is an island off West Africa but is under Portuguese control, and that's because of the line of Tordesillas. You know how most of these South American and Latin American countries are very much Spanish speaking, except for Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. And that's because this line of Tordesillas gives Brazil to the Portuguese and the rest of the South American continent to the Spanish.
oh. So everything to everything to the west went to Spain, and everything to the east went to. I
Portugal.
can't remember what you said. Pardon me.
Portugal.
Portugal. Okay.
Yes, this was between Spain and Portugal.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So, that is that's like sets the foundation for the imperial age and the age of exploration and the reason that the Spanish had such monopolistic control over the Caribbean. But of course, the British and the French and a little bit the Dutch came in and they had something to say about that. And then eventually it went from a Spanish monopoly to largely a British monopoly in the Caribbean. And then the third, like, major migratory wave is the Chinese and East Indian indentured workers who came under the contract system that was established just after slavery. While the Chinese left the field and opened shops, the East Indians stayed and toiled, and in many cases acquired the same land that they worked. And so that shows you the two different ways in which these groups of people who came to the Caribbean post-slavery developed economic stability and economic control. The Chinese moved into a more urban way of economy, whereas the Indians kept a more rural, like land owning focused way of economical development. And it's different obviously because when they came, they were not like completely stripped of their culture, their humanity, and their language and any of their rights. They still were not treated well. They were definitely still exploited. Because the history of the Caribbean, and I will say this again and again, the history of the Caribbean is the history of exploitation of people's labor. And so, of course, the Chinese and East Indian workers, when they came, they were also exploited. But it was not as dehumanizing and dehumanized in its structure as it was with the African slaves who were brought. And so, um, things like establishing strong economic communities and getting a strong foothold in the places where they were was actually something that was feasible for these Chinese and East Indian indentured workers. So that's the migration. The different people coming and going to different parts of the Caribbean is a very important part of not just the Caribbean, this is for any human society in any part of the world. Different people coming and going is a very important part of how a society becomes structured. On the PCSG YouTube channel, if you go and watch the recording of the class that I did last week, I go into a bit more detail about some interesting and like really helpful examples of how the movement of peoples and the migration of peoples and their geography and so on, these push and pull factors that cause people to go places or leave places helps to shape how the society is made up and structured.
Yeah, so okay.
Part two.
Um,
Okay, go ahead.
one more thing.
Yeah,
One more thing. The syllabus said something about establishment of settlement patterns. Um, what are they? What are they? What mean?
establishment of settlement patterns. So you're talking about who came to the Caribbean and made it their home, basically. So the first people, of course, were the Caribbean people, the Amerindians, whether that's the Taino, the Kalinago, or any of the many different Amerindian groups. This syllabus doesn't go a lot into them. The Caribbean history syllabus does a little bit more. But yeah, those are the first people who came and settled in the islands of the Caribbean and all of these, Western lands, the Americas. That's the first pattern of settlement. But the second one is the Europeans who, when they came, they made settlements and colonies. And yes, there were already people living here, but because of the way that the Europeans treated those people and the places and their imperialism approach, saying we're coming, and they treated it as their God-given right to the land, and so they didn't really do it as people going to a place where there are already people. They treated it as we're going and discovering new lands. It's the explorer's mentality that informs so much of Western, specifically European and American culture and ways of thinking about things. So they set up settlements, like in Barbados, for example. It's a slightly different example in Barbados because when the Europeans who did settle Barbados came, uh, the native people of the region were no longer in Barbados. Um,
Sorry about that. I have problems with this device sometimes.
no problem. I understand.
Please
Right.
continue.
So yes, these people when they came to Barbados, they didn't find anyone here, and so it's slightly different in Barbados, but it's still one of these settlement patterns that the syllabus would be talking about. The British came and set up their settlement in 1625, and then when they came back in 1627, they set up an official British colony. Yeah,
By settlements, we mean like homes.
basically, a settlement is just coming to a place and setting up shop, setting up home, making it your home.
Hmm. Okay.
Any more
Thank you.
questions about migratory patterns before we go on to cultural impacts?
Mm, no, sir.
Okay,
I think I I think I have it all. Yeah, we
so
can, we can move on.
yeah, cultural impacts. Again, I go a lot more into this in the lecture that I did last week, so you can go and watch that recording on the YouTube channel after this when you have time. But to sum it up very briefly, as I said, different groups of people being in a place they always have an influence and an impact on the way that that place becomes structured and shaped, and the general identity of that place. And the main story of the cultural impacts of different groups of people on the Caribbean historically is the story of syncretism or Creole, because it's about, and these two words, syncretism and Creole, are kind of used to describe the same phenomenon. So Creole, um, well, nowadays we know the word Creole as a language that is made up of two languages interacting in an environment, and it kind of morphs into its own new language. But back in those days, when they used the word Creole, they meant of people or culture being of one origin, but coming up in but developing in the Caribbean. So whether it's people who are of African descent, in this case the slaves, but who were born in the Caribbean, or whether it's a kind of some form of cultural phenomenon that is of a group of people who are not native to the place and the environment in which that cultural phenomenon develops, that is Creole. And syncretism is very similar. Syncretism is often used to describe religions, um, but it can also be used in other applications. Syncretism means the mixing of disparate aspects of some of two like cultures or religions or musical traditions or cuisines, something like that. Um, so, for example, Indian cuisine, when the East Indians brought their culture and their cuisine and their knowledge of cooking to the Caribbean, all of the ingredients in the Caribbean were not exactly what they would have had um, in the subcontinent of India, and so they might have had to make some slight adjustments and adaptations to where they were. A really interesting example of syncretism is in the this is a bit outside the Caribbean. It's in mainland Central America, but the Mayans, um, because of their many centuries of interaction with Roman Catholic, Spanish colonists, and imperial rulers of many different sorts, the religion that a lot of the people of Mayan descent nowadays practice is a syncretism of the traditional like polytheistic Mayan religion and Roman Catholicism, and it's very much like a mixture of those two. There are other examples of syncretism, and one that's very important to remember when you're looking at the history of African slavery is, of course, the Islamic Empire in its expansion into North and West Africa. Um, Ended up being the home of a lot of syncretism in West Africa. And so a lot of the slaves who would have come from West Africa to the Caribbean would have been Muslim, at least in name and in their tradition. You know, if you ask them what is your religion, they would say that they are Muslim. But the way that Islam was practiced in a lot of these North and West African kingdoms and parts of the Islamic Empire in Africa was, as you say, not exactly halal. It was not strictly um, Islam as it would be in the Arabian Peninsula, where it came from. And there was a lot of combining of Islam and the Islamic philosophy and maybe some Islamic theology with some of the elements of the traditional polytheistic West African religions and a lot of their practices. And so there's an interesting account of one traveler from the Islamic world named Ibn Battuta, who he was traveling through North and West Africa and noticing that the way that the people practiced Islam in these parts of Africa was not halal. There were certain foods that they ate that, according to strict Islam, they were not supposed to eat, certain practices that they had, and so on. And so that's an important part of the history of the Africans who came to the Caribbean that you have to remember is that that's their religious background to the extent that those who came those who first came and actually had any experience in Africa at all would have had a religious background, but of course, the Europeans did their very best to beat that religion and culture and any form of humanity out of them. So that's syncretism. And the history of the Caribbean is the history of two cultures meeting, or two people meeting, or more than two people in some cases, meeting and interacting in various ways. Our history is the history of the interaction between Africans and Europeans, as violent as it is. In other islands, it's about the Europeans and Africans and also the native people. And so, again, as I talked about in the last week's lecture, the way that um, the different demographies of the different Caribbean islands are. So, whether it's a lot of Amerindian or like a lot of Taino in this one island and none in another island, and whether it's the French or the British or the Spanish doing the European colonialism, All of that has unique effects on the way that the culture and the society develops. Any questions before systems of production?
Um, no, sir.
All right. So, the factors which accounted for the movement of people within the region have to do a lot with systems of production. And so you have, for example, under the Spanish systems, you have encomienda and repartimiento, um, which are various systems of production involving the enslavement um, and exploitation of the labor of the indigenous people of the Caribbean. Um, Systems of production also plays a lot into the history and structure of class in the Caribbean. Um, and of course, the class was very, very race based in its construction and stratification. So, key points. Historically, the systems of production in the Caribbean were made up of forced labor, as you know, whether it was the indigenous people being enslaved, or European prisoners being made indentured servants, or the African slaves brought in their millions, or the exploitation of the labor of the immigrants that they brought in after slavery ended. It was all about forced labor. The plantation economy was seen as the base of society, which influenced all social institutions. And I think there's few better places to study this than in Barbados because of Barbados's lack of any external or confounding variables. It was just Africans and Europeans, and it's a very small island, and so it was pretty much covered um, coast to coast in plantation. You step off of the field of one plantation owner and you are immediately on another's property. Barbados was functionally one large plantation. And so Barbados was described by Professor Hilary Beckles as the first true slave society because of the sheer prevalence and prominence of the plantation and plantation economy and plantation society in Barbados. And so it influenced things like family, education, and religion. Again, what little of it the Africans were allowed to participate in. And even though the various migratory groups, such as the Amerindians, Africans, East Indians, Chinese, were faced with the same forms of forced labor, or somewhat the same, they all forged ahead to develop the Caribbean societies of today. Um, okay. The systems of production, of course, being fundamentally oppressive in their nature, a large and important part of the history of the Caribbean is responses to oppression and resistance of the oppression. And again, went through this in last week's lecture, so I won't spend too long on it. But you have um, marronage, so basically running away from the plantation and trying to forge your own life. You have grand marronage, where a lot of slaves will run away and get their own like plot of land and set up shop there, which is possible in a place like Jamaica. You have petit marronage, where um, one individual or a few slaves will run away and they won't be able to set up a whole community or society because of resources and numbers, but they'll like live out in the bush, in a gully, in a cave somewhere, just to get out of the system. And uh, right, and then we have urban and maritime marronage, which speak for themselves. Urban marronage means you get into an urban area, a town, a city, and you make your way by providing some good or service. And maritime marronage, you get on a boat, you now work in on a boat, and you live in the sea, and you are out of the plantation system. And boats, ship working on a ship was a lot more equal in terms of treatment of people. Okay. We talked about the factors in the success of the Maroons, their geography, interactions with the indigenous people who themselves knew the lands that the Maroons were going to have to live off of if they wanted to be successful. and of course, strong religious and social leaders. We have East Indian passive responses as well: refusal to sign contracts, go slow action, protests and strikes led by the East Indian National Association. Because again, the East Indian exploitation of labor was about contracts that they signed and were just bad contracts. They were not honored. The terms in the contracts were rejected or ignored. A lot of them, their literacy was quite low, and so they were tricked into signing contracts that they believed would be for their own good and would lead to a better life, and just wasn't the case. And so they had their own methods of passive resistance. And of course, the peasantry. And peasantry just means like a community and economy where the farmers are in control. It's usually poor working class farmers who form a little society or community. And so they established villages and communities, diversified the economy by growing, crops that were not just one singular cash crop, that were both detrimental to the environment and also very, very bad for the economy. Um, they had informal cooperatives, such as meeting turns. You can look that up. That's quite interesting. If you plan to delve deeper into this topic, you can write an essay about meeting turns as a method of passive resistance and something to do with the peasantry. They developed the interior of many territories. Since the Europeans were using the Caribbean for trade, they were maritime or naval people in the way that they did things. A lot of them were very much coastal people. They were set up on the coasts, and so the interior of the land was not as developed as it could have been. And so the peasantry developed the interior of a lot of these territories. They helped to develop the nation and were able to practice their culture without fear of persecution because they had a degree of economic autonomy. And we also have some active responses. Revolts were numerous and drew massive support from the oppressed people. Slave revolts. Everyone knows what slave revolts are, and we know the big ones. The purpose of revolts was to show that the oppressed would could successfully retaliate and would successfully retaliate. Revolts had a significant impact on Caribbean society and culture. A lot of national heroes in a lot of different places in the Caribbean and in this entire part of the world, in the Americas, really, a lot of what you might call national heroes are revolutionary leaders, people who led resistance against the European oppressors. And they also had an impact, not a large impact and certainly not the main impact, but they had an impact on the abolitionist and emancipatory movements back in Blighty in the UK. And so one of the things that was a factor in, turning people towards the humanitarian side of the abolitionists' cause was to inform them of the true bloody violence of slavery in the Caribbean and to spread the news and the fame of these revolutionary leaders who um, went to war against a people with much more deadly technology and more military organization and resources, and successfully in some cases, and unsuccessfully in a lot more, led revolts against these Europeans. These very bloody and very dramatic revolts, and the fame of these did have an impact in getting the humanitarian support for abolitionist movements in the UK. Okay, then we also have movements towards independence. Key terms in this module are political enfranchisement, which just mean enfranchisement just means being gaining or being given the right to participate in something. So political enfranchisement is about having the right to participate in the political process, having the right, for example, to vote. Which brings us to the next term, universal adult suffrage, which just suffrage not as in suffering in the modern sense of the word, but suffer in the Old English sense of the word, which means to allow. When the Bible says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me," he's saying, "Allow them to come unto me." And so, universal adult suffrage literally means adults are allowed or suffered to vote. and internal government or internal self-government. Okay, that's right. Political enfranchisement, um, the movements, and since you did this already, again, we'll just go through it quickly. The movements that went into political enfranchisement and self-governance came with a lot of strong Caribbean leaders and a lot of influence from socialism and Marxism in a lot of the Caribbean islands. And we will definitely get to that later in the syllabus. The economic enfranchisement, so credit unions, for example, are a great case of economic enfranchisement, people actually being able to participate in a meaningful and autonomous way in the economy and the control of the economy. And a credit union is simply a financial institution owned and controlled by its members. But other methods of economic enfranchisement that we mentioned already, for example, the peasantry, establishing free villages, the Chinese moving into urban environments and gaining a strong urban foothold in the economy. We have the Indians, working the land and eventually owning that land that they worked, and that was a form of economic enfranchisement for them. And yeah, we'll get into the functionalist and structuralist perspectives. Um, okay, this session is about to run out of time, so I'll just stop here and we'll get back into it. I'll reopen the Zoom link as soon as I close it. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So um, the functionalist perspective, and perspective is going to be an important word in Caribbean studies in the future. Uh, so, the functionalist perspective on economic enfranchisement um, talks about societies having commonalities. So, any human society will have various commonalities in the way that it is structured, different groups of people with different interests and different skill sets contributing to the society in different ways, and every um, group influencing that society in a particular way. And I don't know how important the difference between functionalist and structuralist perspective will be for this syllabus, but I think it is worth explaining. A functionalist perspective is one that the um, looks at something through the lens of what it does. And a structuralist perspective, on the other hand, is a perspective that looks at something through the lens of what it's made of, what constitutes it. And this is a big deal in, for example, psychology, which I'm studying at the moment.
Um,
Yeah,
this is for economic and franchise, right?
yes, but it will be applied to lots more areas of the syllabus in the future. We're going to be
Okay.
looking at things through a particular perspective, whether we're talking about
Can
functionalist
you
or structure.
explain them again?
Right, functionalist looks at a thing by virtue of what it does. So, for example, if you take a functionalist perspective of an automobile, a car, you are looking at the fact that it's about transport, um, it's about um, moving from place to place, it's about holding things, um, it's about carrying people. It can play music, maybe, so you look at that. And if you look at it from a structuralist perspective, which is looking at what a thing is made of, what makes up a thing, then you look at it as an engine, wheels, doors, windows. It has gasoline. It has a battery. It has an exhaust system and so on. So that's
Okay.
functionalist and structuralist. Yeah, there. It's. I don't know that it's especially important that you know the distinction, but it will be helpful to understand it when it does come up again later on in the syllabus. But you'll be
Yes, sir.
looking at things in this syllabus through multiple perspectives a lot. So, for example, later we will get on to things like the conflict perspective or conflict theories for certain institutions and societal phenomena that we look at, and we will explain that more when we get there.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's historical perspectives, um, culture and society. This is a big one. Have you gotten started culture and society as yet?
Mm. No, sir.
Okay, cool.
We
So
only, yeah, okay.
yeah, we'll go a little bit slower and we'll take our time going through culture and society. So
Yes, sir.
the Latin cultura or cultus means care or cultivation, and those are the words, of course, from which we get the English culture.
Mm.
So culture, according to, and we're going to get various thinkers' definitions and classifications of culture. So Dressier describes culture as a social heritage transmitted from one generation to another and shared from one generation to another. It consists of the sum total of skills, beliefs, knowledge, and products that are commonly shared by the number of people and transmitted to their children. So he looks at culture in terms of heredity. What aspects of a society, of a people, do they pass on to the next generation? Then we have Smith, Stanley, and Shores, who look at culture as the fabric of ideas, beliefs, skills, and products, and knowledge, and so on, which are shared among a group of people. And so they look at culture in terms of it being shared by a group. And then we have Bertrand, who says that culture is the complex whole which comprise of knowledge, beliefs, skills. So the things that make up culture are going to be the same across any different definition that you find. It's the skills, the knowledge, the products, and the beliefs and ideas, as well as, of course, the norms of a group of people, and that's culture. It's important that culture be shared pretty universally across a particular group, and it's important that culture be passed down from generation to generation. It doesn't have to be passed down in the exact form in which it's um, currently exists, and of course, you probably are aware of that. Again, Caribbean studies is just the life that you live and this environment that you live it in. And so all of this is nothing new to you. You already live it, you already experience it every day. We're just putting some fancy academic words to it. And so let's do that. And we're going to talk about the ways in which culture changes or stays the same by looking at classifications of culture. So we have static culture, which means the same culture or the same cultural patterns being transmitted generationally. So let's take, not all these examples are going to be Caribbean, because Caribbean culture, um, looking at Caribbean culture is always going to be complex and problematic for multiple reasons, simply because of the ways in which Caribbean people have been so historically and systematically oppressed that development of a culture and maintenance of a culture is something that they've had to work towards, and it doesn't really show up in a very organic way. And while that is important to study in itself, when we're just looking at the very basics of it, we'll look at more naturalistic and more organic cultures. So, for example, the same culture or same cultural patterns being transmitted generationally. When you look at um, Christianity in the old world, in Ethiopia or India or Greece or Russia, in any of the places where Christianity has been, for a thousand for close to the 2,000 years, and you look at the practices of it, you realize that a lot of the practices of the people's culture, so the things that people do, were passed on basically without change from generation to generation. For example, the Lord's Prayer, that's pretty much been the same since it was first translated into English. When modern Christians say the Lord's Prayer, they say, "Our Father who art in heaven." That "art" is an Old English word. That's not how we use. That's not how we conjugate the verb to be in modern English. But because something like the Lord's Prayer is static culture, it is passed down basically unchanged for that long. We have dynamic culture, where culture and patterns change generationally. And for this example, I'm going to use the Caribbean because there's a really, really accessible example in Caribbean music. And so, traditionally, um, the forms of Caribbean music that developed after slavery, you had things like spooge, you had a lot of European influences in the music, and as it went on through the generations. Um, Spooge, you get Calypso and the social commentary that comes about through Calypso, and from Calypso you get to what you might call Sweet Soca, and from Sweet Soca you then come to what you might call Bashment Soca. These aren't just variations on a particular musical product of a culture; they are adaptations and evolutions of it. So soca came out of calypso, um, and bashment came out of soca. Then we have stable culture, where folk ways and mores or mores, which are just the ways that people do things, are satisfying, and so new elements are integrated smoothly into a culture. And so, for example, things like cuisine. Um, in Mexico, in various parts of Mexico where tacos came into being. Traditionally, tacos were made with corn flour, because that was the flour that was available and grew naturally and was used by the people who originated the taco. But of course, different people in different places use different things, and so whereas in the southern areas of Mexico, corn was the main staple crop. In the northern territories that nowadays have been taken over by the Americans, but in northern territories of Mexico, wheat was the common staple, and so the cuisine, um, the taco itself being a stable cultural product, it did have to adapt, and it integrated this new element of a different kind of flour. And so you have wheat tacos in the northern areas of um, Mexico where wheat was available, and that is what you might call a stable culture. The new element, in this case being wheat flour, was integrated smoothly into the um, cultural product that was stable, which is the taco. Go ahead.
What's the difference between that one and the dynamic culture? They both
Dynamic
basically sound the same to me.
Dynamic culture is one thing being replaced by another over time. So it would be as though you started out with, back then they used to make tacos out of corn flour, and now they've changed and they've made them out of wheat flour. But that's not what happens. That's not what we're talking about. Stable culture is a culture that is itself stable and lasting and can integrate new elements smoothly and easily. So something can be added to it and it stays stable. It's not one thing being replaced by another, it's just new elements being added and integrated into the culture that was already there. You get where I'm coming from?
Yes, sir.
Cool.
it's not being replaced, but just new materials are being integrated.
Yes.
That's what I thought from it.
Cool. And then unstable culture. There are no satisfying solutions, and so a lot of the problems that exist in societies with unstable cultures exist because of the clashing of traditional groups with radical groups that want to change things up. Um, so, for an example of this, let's see, where can we go? Um, I suppose we can actually look at America, the United States of America, where the United States of America was founded by religious Puritans, was what they were called. These were people who had very specific Protestant values, and the whole like philosophy and theology, everything that they did was informed by these um, very traditional, very strict Puritan Protestant values. And the a lot of the problems that resulted in American culture were because people moved away from the religious lifestyle and the religious beliefs and philosophies that the country was originally founded on, and whether that was immigrants who were either not Protestant but some other denomination of Christian, or not Protestant um, in the traditional Puritan way, but Protestant in a way that was um, like, for example, the Methodists, the Baptists, some of the Protestant denominations that developed out of the interaction of the West African enslaved people with these Protestant denominations, or whether it was people who had a different religion entirely, the Chinese immigrants that came in that would have had a different religion and different religious background. And these new elements that were coming into the society clashed with the traditional elements that were already there, the traditional groups of people and the values of these traditional groups of people, and that causes problems. So that's unstable culture. So stable culture means that new elements can be integrated without conflict, and unstable culture means that new elements coming in clash with and cause friction and conflict with the traditional groups and their traditional values. Moving on to forms of culture. We have material culture, so these are tangible things, the way your house is built, whether it's a round house or a square house, whether the roof is made of grass or of um, leaves. Um, that's material culture. Non material culture is symbolic or intangible elements of culture, sentiments, systems of beliefs, norms, morals, and so on. Um, so you have this word mores, Mores, which just refers to heavily sanctioned folk ways, or basically the things that people do and the way they do them, for group survival, and which are accepted without question as they embody the moral values of the group. Um, so those are mores, and those are often intangible but sometimes tangible um, aspects of forms of culture, as they say. A custom is just any habitual practice. Right, so that's classifications of culture and forms of culture, which is just material, non-material, mores, folkways, customs. Okay, characteristics of culture. Culture is a uniquely human thing. So, sometimes groups of animals might have specific ways of doing things that are unique to their groups. They might have their own calls. Birds might have their own calls depending on where they live, or wolves might have their own howls depending on where they are and what they eat, and things like that. But culture is uniquely human. Human cultures vary from, and a lot of that variance is caused by geography, but they all resemble one another in some respect or another. And a great example of the way that geography influences culture is the difference between Mayan city states and city states in Europe or Asia or Africa. So, Europe, Asia, Africa, they all have relatively easy access to horses and to cows and sheep, and in some places where they eat pigs, pigs, and lots of different kinds of um, fowl, which are all very easily domesticatable, or domesticable is the word, really. So they can be domesticated, and in the case of horses, they're great for riding. They're good pack animals. They have oxen that can do heavy labor. They have cows, which are large cattle that people can eat. And in the Americas, they don't really have those. So North America has buffalo, but buffalo are not domesticable. Um, you can't really domesticate buffalo, and that has to do with their germination period. It's the same reason you can't domesticate an elephant. Um, and South America has, I mean, they don't really have that many large, and they have like llama or alpacas, um, but they are not super cooperative with human beings, and they are not, they can carry loads, but because of their small size and their structure, they can't carry such massive loads as, for example, oxen or horses or donkeys. And so um, that changes the culture of places. Um, so animal labor is a big part of the culture of places that have lots of easily agreeable, easily domesticable pack animals, um, like oxen and horses and so on. Whereas in Aztec culture, um, or Mayan culture, it was not really animals that did the majority of the labor, it was human beings. So instead of carrying things up mountains on the backs of horses or plowing fields with oxen, they didn't have animals that could do that, and so it was all human beings doing the labor. And so that the ways that the architecture was different has in large part to do with what they had access to and what they were making the architecture for. So they didn't have a lot of, you know, animal markets and so on because, again, they didn't really have a lot of super domesticable um, animals that you might eat. Um, but they had great irrigation and general like plant biodiversity. And so, whereas animal husbandry practices are a large part of the culture in Europe and Asia, in Africa. Um, in the Americas, it wasn't really all about animal husbandry, it was about agriculture. And so in the Americas, they had some of the most advanced systems of agriculture in the world. And because of that, water storage and water movement um, and drainage and so on were very important. And so the aqueducts in Mayan cities far outclassed anything that the Romans had, simply because, or I guess one of the reasons, is because of the way that their biodiversity and their geography affected the way that they built. In certain places in Europe or in Asia or in Africa, they had lots of like super flat savanna or maybe even desert or like plains, and so that affects the way that they build. Whereas in the Americas, they either have steep and kind of drastic mountainous terrain, or they have like really, really dense rainforest and jungle and so on. And again, all of that affects the way that they do things. Um, so yeah, that's human culture varying, but all of it resembles each other in specific aspects. So whether it's animal husbandry or architecture, um, it's all about how are we going to feed ourselves. And so the cultures that arise around how human beings are going to feed themselves are all similar in one way or another. Culture tends to persist once learned and accepted. And a great example of the opposite of this is, or I guess the exception to this, is in the Caribbean and in the Americas, where either the people who they came and found had their culture destroyed and systematically beaten out of them, or the people that they brought from Africa had their culture destroyed and systematically beaten out of them. And yet, some of the cultures still persisted. A lot of the ways that we speak in the Caribbean are they have influences, however large or small those influences are depending on which Caribbean territory you're talking about, and exactly what kind of person you are. The way that we speak takes a lot of influences from the way that West African languages worked, and so a lot of what was traditionally thought of as broken English, yes, the English was broken, but we patched it with pieces of European languages, with pieces of African languages, and so the influences of those West African languages are present in the way that a lot of Caribbean people speak nowadays because culture persists. The exchange of culture happens gradually and continuously, and so you get Creole languages developing where people who speak different languages, they are in the same environment, they're in the same place, they have to communicate somehow, and it starts with what you call in linguistics a pidgin language, not the bird, Pidgin, which is just the most crude way of people who speak different languages trying to find some mutual way to communicate with each other. And then eventually you develop a Creole language, which is a mixture of these two languages because the exchange of culture gradually and continuously happens. And so even nowadays, the language of anyone who interacts with a culture impacts the language of everyone else in that culture. And last thing on the characteristics of culture is that cultures borrow from others. And so subcultures um, all behave differently, but cultures borrow from others. So whether it was the traditional Amerindian ways of cooking, borrowing from the ways that the East Indians and the Chinese brought, or the traditional ways that West Africans cooked, being influenced by the ingredients that were available to them under European colonialism, cultures borrow from one another. And what happens is when people are as stratified as rigidly as they were under European colonialism and imperialism and slavery and the encomienda and the repartimiento and indentureship and apprenticeship and all of these systems of exploitation of labor, subcultures, which is these people who have their own internal culture that has to interact with cultures outside of them, in group and out group, as you know it in the sociological sciences, these cultures develop and they form and they develop and they behave differently from each other, and they all have to interact with and are shaped by one another in the society. So that's this week. Next week we're going to move on to um, educational implications, and then we're going to talk about some of the functions of culture, and we're going to go more deeply into characteristics of Caribbean culture. So, the thing I was talking about before, hybridization, and all the different cultural phenomena that are definitely going to be important on the multiple choice paper and will always be good essay topics in the long paper. Any questions before we close?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for your time. Um, I will see you next week, God willing, same time, same place.